At the end of the last blind run that I did, which was Pokemon X, I decided to give my final thoughts on the game at the end of the series, and I thought that I'd do the same thing here. I have said most of my opinions on this game in earlier videos, but consolidating them all in one place might definitely help people who are maybe still a little on the fence about this game. Because I guess you could treat this as kind of like a review. And on that note, I have not looked at any reviews of this game. I have just seen vague summaries of reviews on Wikipedia, and that's basically all. So, I haven't actually looked at any reviews in this game. In fact, I've disowned game reviews entirely, due to a string of incidents that basically proved to me that all game reviewers are idiots who don't know anything about games at all. So I generally rely more on just general popular opinion and YouTube videos to decide whether or not to get a game these days. So yeah, my overall thoughts on this game, like with X and Y, yeah, I think this is how I did with X and Y. I'll start with the negatives to get them out of the way, and then move towards the positives. Now, I will say there is definitely more positive than negative about this game. In summary, I can't help but compare this game to another turn-based strategy RPG with real-time movement and aiming. I like to call this Valkyria Chronicles style because it was the first game of this style that I did pretty much play. It's hard to really describe what the genre actually is. Like, again, turn-based strategy RPG with real-time aiming it sounds a bit weird, but that is the best way I can describe it. Now, I played Codename Steam earlier this year, which I was really hyped for because it was from the makers of Fire Emblem, and had an interesting cast of characters, and I was really eager to see another game in the kind of Valkyria Chronicles style. And there is a reason why you haven't seen a playthrough of Codename Steam's main story on this channel. Honestly, I didn't find the main single player of Codename Steam to be all that impressive. The map design was a little bland, the characters barely developed very much at all. Now, I could excuse the plot for being barely anything, but the fact that the characters just... nothing much was really done with them, which was disappointing since you had a lot of interesting characters taken from literature. And probably the most damning thing was that the difficulty felt very, very cheap at points. I didn't think it was a terrible game, but it definitely did not live up to my high expectations. This game, on the other hand, I personally like this game a lot better than I like Codename Steam. It definitely isn't perfect, and overall, I probably didn't like it as much as Valkyria Chronicles, but I definitely enjoyed this game a lot, and for a completely new thing, it was actually very, very good. But again, let's just get the problems out of the way first. And the biggest flaw that I can find in this game is something that I didn't even notice until a second playthrough, and which means that I must have just got really lucky on the first run, because this only really started happening afterwards, is that the game was actually very, very crash-happy for me. Frequently, it would crash right before a mission during loading, forcing me to reset the console and go back and reload the mission. Sometimes, even worse, it would crash at the end of a mission before the game saved, meaning that I would have to redo the mission again. This happened, if you've watched some of the earlier videos, this happened right after fighting the traitors at the end of my second run, which was very frustrating. There were some missions that I had to repeat as often as 3 times in a row because of this crashing. Sometimes the game would also fail to load cutscenes or attack animations, and I'm not really sure what was causing this, because I've heard some people in the comments tell me that they're playing the Vita version and they didn't notice any crashes like this, so unless that's exclusive to the PS3 version of the game, I don't know. And if anyone else has played this game, has this game crashed like it has for me, for you? Because I'm not sure if there are other factors involved here. But anyway, the crashing did get very annoying. Now, second major, well, okay. This seems like kind of a minor thing. Now, during the whole second playthrough, I did complain a lot about the randomized elements. The randomization of the traitor was not kind to me on the second run, and I got almost all repeat traitors of who I got in the first playthrough. Now, here's the thing though, as frustrating as that was, that really is just luck. I can't really say it's a flaw of the game, personally. In my 3 runs of the game, I did have certain people turn out innocent more often than not, and certain people turn out to be traitors in all 3 of my attempts. But I've only played the game 3 times, so there is a confirmation bias thing going on. If, say, you were to do like 100 playthroughs or something, there would definitely be more variance, and in fact, I've heard people point out that someone else on YouTube did a playthrough of this game, and they had Yoko always turn out to be a traitor, which is interesting because in my run, she was always innocent. This seems to confirm to me that the traitor allocation is in fact completely random, and with the exception of maybe the game being rigged towards George being innocent on the second run, which I think is probably true, all characters have the same weighting when it comes to being the traitor. So, really, I can't quite blame my bad luck on a flaw of the game at all. And honestly, I do think the whole randomized traitor system is very interesting and does allow for a lot more replay value. There's only one point, though, where it got annoying, and this isn't an issue of the traitor system itself, but an issue of the way the game handles the... Well, it's more the fact that there are actually 2 components to the true ending. The true ending itself, which requires you to have all bonds maxed out, which can only be done on a second playthrough at minimum, and then there's the true form of the final boss, the bitter end. Getting him requires you to get to the end on a true ending run, that is with all bonds maxed from carryover playthroughs, and with no traitors in your party on the final floor. I think most of my frustrations with this system simply come from the fact they separated these 2 elements. Personally, I feel like they should have had you fight the bitter end on any true ending run, regardless of whether you had traitors in your party or not. And maybe they were just thinking that he'd be too hard without a full party, I don't know, but I mean, honestly the bitter end wasn't that bad. They were actually quite tough, but with the right strategy you could fairly easily do it with less characters, I think. The real issue was, though, that by separating these 2 elements of the real final battle, in fact the final battle has a different title depending on whether you get the true final boss or just the true ending, or neither, so there's 3 variations. What this does is, it means that, at minimum, you need 2 playthroughs to see everything there is to offer in the game, if you're lucky. But if you're unlucky, you need 3 playthroughs to get the true final boss, and that did annoy me a bit. Mainly due to the fact that, typical me, I got unlucky right off the bat, and so I had to do 3 playthroughs. Honestly, I feel like they should have merge these 2. Again, making you fight the bitter end with just the criteria for the true ending, that is maxing all bonds. And it would also make the whole thing feel a bit more conjoined, because previously the bitter end felt like this random feature that wasn't really tied into the story very well. I was at least half expecting he'd get some kind of one-winged angel transformation, but he didn't. He just looks exactly the same, he just has better stats, and maybe some of his moves he only uses in this form. I don't know, because I never really saw much of the regular form of the end's attacks. But if they had you fight the bitter end on the true ending run, that would make sense from a plot standpoint. You finally know what's really going on, and so, as your reward for that, and to give the game better closure, you fight the real form of the final boss. Basically, I'm just a little annoyed they made getting the bitter end on your second playthrough a matter of pure luck. Because, as I showed in the videos, if any one of the 3 people who were traitors before the 4th stratum on the first playthrough end up as traitors before the 4th stratum on the second playthrough, then you are not getting the bitter end in that run. Speaking of New Game Plus, another issue that I have with this game is the way they handle the carryover of gift experience into a New Game Plus. Now, I see what they were going for by simply just giving you the gift experience, but actually completely resetting everyone's skill trees. They're making it so that if you want to try and go for other skills that you didn't learn in an earlier playthrough, you can. You can redistribute the gift experience accordingly. The problem with that is, by the time you get onto a third playthrough or further, you're basically gonna be able to max out everything anyway, and because of that, having to distribute roughly 60 GP to every character at the start of the playthrough takes a very long time. I would have preferred if they just simply had the characters' skill trees, like learned skills, just carry over directly, and you simply got new GP as you progressed and could level up skills that you already had or learn new ones, expand on the trees that you had from the end of the last run. Yeah, I see what they were going for, but it takes such a long time to spend 40 to 60 gift experience on every character. Now, other minor flaws that I have. There is the fact that a lot of characters learn some pretty crazily broken moves towards the end of their skill trees. Honestly, this actually is a very minor thing, because I felt that they didn't really come into play until a New Game Plus, and by that point, you were pretty much just breezing through the game anyway, and you know, New Game Pluses are not really supposed to be hard in general. They're meant to be a bit of a catharsis factor where you can just let loose with ridiculously overpowered characters. And generally, the really broken moves like Summon Allies and Brain Hacker, you usually only get them towards the end of a first playthrough run anyway, so by that point there really isn't that much left to do in the game. I will say though, I personally feel like Brain Hacker is a little bit too good. Basically, the fact that it buffs all allies in all stats, including movement and critical, is kind of ridiculous. Personally, I think they should have handled it one of two other ways. Either not have it buff all stats, but have it apply to the whole party, or, if you were going to make it buff all stats, make it single targeting, and not full party. Personally, I would be fine with a all stats buff if it was only for one ally. That would actually be quite balanced in my opinion, but buffing all stats on all allies is a bit insane, and speaking of insane, the sanity costs on the move aren't actually that high, so you can actually freely spam it, and spam Yoko's other attacks as well. Yoko in general I found to be one character who verges on maybe a little bit too good, but really, she's more of a Magikarp type character. You don't usually see her skills until roughly mid to end game. Early on, she really can't do anything with her high Psi stats. Once she learns Psychic Assault and gets access to materia of other characters, she gets pretty crazy, but even then she is quite frail and has relatively low movements. The fact that her area attacks don't hurt allies, though, makes them quite a bit more powerful than other people's area attacks, so that maybe is a little bit too strong. Oddly enough though, I personally felt like Nagi, originally I thought that she'd fall into the too good category as well, with her incredible movement, and her having a lot of attacks that let her avoid counters. The thing is though, Nagi has relatively low power, and that really shows later on in the game. I personally feel like Nagi actually isn't all that overpowered. She's actually quite balanced in my opinion. She does have really good movement and can fly over intervening terrain, but she has relatively weak attack power on her own. Agito as well. Now, he's got great movement and the ability to go through any intervening obstacles, but he's balanced out by his lack of area attacks. In fact, he doesn't get any area attacks aside from Fate Materia, so personally I feel like that actually makes him a bit better. Better as in more balanced, but yeah, a bit more balanced too, because area attacks are really, really useful in this game. In general, I feel the character balance is quite good, with one exception. I still feel like Himeno is a little bit underpowered. And here's the thing. I learned in later playthroughs that her lava skills from the combustion tree are really, really good. They have great area to them, which kind of circumvents her low range, do good damage, and they're just very, very good skills in general. They're quite cheap in terms of sanity and GP as well. The problem is her other two trees, Pyrokinesis and whatever the ice ones. See, here's the thing. It's a testament to how much it sucks that I can't even remember the name of her frost tree because I barely even used it. The fact that there are no elemental weaknesses or resistances in this game means that differing elements don't really make too much of a difference. Ice attacks are essentially the same as fire, and when her fire attacks have the fact they get stronger every time you use them with ignition, there's really no reason to use her ice attacks. They do inflict seal or lowered movement sometimes, but personally I felt that lowered movement wasn't too useful in a game where you can't see enemies' movement ranges in the first place. That's actually another flaw of the game, to go on a slight tangent, and one of the few flaws that I will mention about the actual strategy of it is that there's no way to view enemies' movement ranges. This sometimes makes it difficult to plan out your moves. But anyway, back to Himeno. Even with Ignition though, I personally feel like that's one of the only good skills in her Pyrokinesis branch. And here's why. While they do decent damage and Himeno does have good Psi, the problem is that they're all disappointingly short-ranged. This, combined with Himeno's low movement and weak defense, and the fact that her standard weapon is melee, I honestly don't know what compelled them to give her knives. I feel like she'd be better suited to using a pistol. And if anything, maybe Marco would be better suited to being the knife user. Because someone with such bad defense and HP, having to get really close to enemies in order to be effective is not a good combination. And Himeno suffers from two other things. Firstly, again, the knives. This means it's much harder for her to get assists, and so her battle rankings tend to suffer at the end of, battles. The other is the fact that because her standard attacks are quite weak, she's one of the few characters that relies almost entirely on GP to do damage, and that means she's very prone to berserking herself. It also means that once her sanity gets low, she is effectively useless, since her regular attacks are just not very useful at all. Even Yoko still does relatively decent damage with guns and has a good critical rate on assist attacks. Himeno just doesn't have that. She cannot function effectively without her gifts, and so once she gets low on sanity, she can't do much. Because of this, I noticed that Himeno tended to lag behind on battle rankings a lot in my first playthrough, even when I was trying to get her to increase it. There's just too many not so good combinations there in terms of her stats and things, and I honestly feel like aside from Combustion, Himeno's skills are better used on other characters than on herself. The only other possible weak link, no pun intended, is Zenji, and that's only because he has to waste a turn before he actually gets, well, useful. I actually quite liked his concept. It was like Zane from Shadow Dragon, only even better, because he actually gets better stats than the person he copies. Unfortunately, having to use up a turn in order to link means that you kinda had to defer to him to make the best use of his link skills. They were quite useful though, and yeah, aside from the fact that he had to waste one turn, he was quite a good party member. And here's the thing though, those are really the only characters that I can find fault with in terms of this game. I personally feel like they did a very good job of making all of the characters unique, and even unique in terms of other strategy RPGs. There are a lot of characters here that I haven't really seen examples of in other mediums, particularly Sojiro. I mean, at first glance, he's your typical healer, but he's also surprisingly good defensively, and he gets those skills that add random statuses to his standard attacks, which makes him quite good for disruption as well as healing. Marco is interesting, how he starts out as more of a typical tank, but ends up as more of a raw damage dealer. Mana has a pretty interesting buff system that I think even now I don't fully understand how to get the best out of it. And George has a ton of really useful passive skills that change his counters to use certain moves, and increase the critical hit rate on particular gift skills. Plus he's got the whole analysis system, and I've already discussed Nagi and Agito earlier. So all of the characters I felt were not only relatively balanced, so to me only Yoko really comes off as maybe too good, and Himeno comes off as maybe a little too weak. But apart from that, they're all quite decent, so I did like that. We're definitely into the positives of the game by now, so yeah, let's keep talking about those. Now, here's something that I cannot praise enough about this game. It's something that I really think is the mark of a good strategy game. Every time that I failed a mission, every time that things went badly, personally, I felt like it was my own fault. And that is something that I can't praise a strategy game enough for. In strategy games like this, you really need to feel like you're in control. You need to feel like that if something goes wrong, you realize, oh, that's because I made a bad decision. And in the vast majority of cases, that's how I felt with this game. And the reason why I think that's so praiseworthy is, even the strategy series that's my personal favourite of all time, Fire Emblem, very frequently, when I fail chapters in Fire Emblem, very often it's not my own fault. I've been playing a bit of Sacred Stones recently, and you won't believe the number of times I had to restart chapters because Joshua, who is a sword master by the way, got hit by two 10% axe users in a row. And with true hit, those hit rates are probably more like 2%. So yeah, definitely not my fault there. And as much as I like Valkyria Chronicles, that game got intensely frustrating for me at several points, because enemy soldiers could randomly duck your attacks, and quite often that could severely screw you over for reasons that didn't feel fair at all. In fact, the DLC bonus mission Behind Her Blue Flame, where you actually get to play as the superpowered Valkyria Sylvaria, I actually failed that mission a lot because enemy soldiers would dodge her attacks constantly. Yeah, my luck is terrible. That mission's supposed to be a breather, and I still have a hard time with it because, yeah, my luck sucks. Even Codename Steam got bad about this sometimes. The random wriggling animations that enemies had meant that you could often miss their weak points at point-blank range, and sometimes your bullets would just spray wildly without any indication of how much accuracy you had. In Lost Dimension, though, I love how this game calculates accuracy. It's a simple number that is clearly visible to you before you make an attack, so if your attack misses, you know that you might have made a bad call with making an attack with that low accuracy, but it's very easy to influence. Accuracy is simply affected by how close or how far you are away from the enemy when you attack, at least for ranged weapons. This again means that when your character misses, it feels more like it was your fault for making the decision to take a shot from further away rather than closer. But if you go closer, then you risk taking a counterattack or exposing yourself to more attacks on the enemy's turn. It's a really nice trade-off, and I really like it. Berserk as well is a really interesting mechanic. It punishes you for spamming your character's special abilities too much, and really makes you think before you just go crazy with them. Berserk can also be used to your advantage, but it is extremely risky, and personally I feel like it is done pretty decently well. Yes, it can be annoying when the AI-controlled Berserk character just goes after you rather than the enemy, but honestly, you were taking that risk in the first place when you had a Berserk character and let them go Berserk near allies. And while Berserk characters can dish out enormous amounts of damage, they also cannot take damage very well at all and will usually go down in 1 or 2 hits. So it is a definite trade-off. The actual maps themselves were fairly interesting, and they presented quite a lot of interesting challenges. Now, they did suffer from Fire Emblem Awakening's whole only route or defeat boss syndrome, although there were a few interesting missions that had you defeating a certain number of bosses. Some of the enemies posed decent challenges, and there was actually a surprising bit of variety even though they recycled basic enemy types. The higher ranked versions of the basic, like slash or shoot or hovering drone enemies, they tended to have new moves and various extra features to keep you on your toes, though sometimes I felt they didn't use their special abilities all that often. This game also didn't fall into the pitfalls that some RPGs do, in that buffs and debuffs were very useful. Debuffs in particular were actually very, very good, until the second playthrough when we were strong enough to basically destroy everything, but until then, they were really useful against bosses or other tough enemies, and status problems were very useful as well. This falls into one of those games where status problems actually are only a minor inconvenience to you, but can be really, really good when used against enemies. The defer system, that's another thing that I quite liked about this game. It was simple, but it was fairly useful. Basically, think of it like a Fire Emblem game where every character is a dancer. except it's balanced out by the fact that people who are deferred to cannot themselves defer again. So, yeah, that's an easy way to handle the infinite dancer problem that Fire Emblem always struggles with by only ever giving you one dancer. It let you cross the map more quickly, but at the expense of some sanity and one of your other character's turns, so I felt that it was quite a balanced mechanic, and again, simple but very effective, and it added a lot of depth to the gameplay. Now, going outside of gameplay, other things that I can praise about this game are really the story and characters, which I actually quite liked. This is interesting because from what I read on Wikipedia, some reviews actually criticize this game's story. Now, here's the thing, I can understand why reviewers would, because I doubt that any reviewer got a chance to play past the first playthrough. And on your first playthrough, you really don't learn very much about the plot at all. And that is maybe another issue of the game. You need a second playthrough before you fully understand everything. On the first playthrough, you really don't start even getting the vaguest idea of what's going on until the fourth floor. And it's not until the actual final battle that you really understand vaguely what's happening, and in the ending. Now, the ending makes it quite obvious what the real problem of the story is. The whole meteor thing, and yeah, spoilers, so yeah, this does contain story spoilers, so warning. The whole meteor thing was fairly easy to figure out from the non-true ending. And personally, I had figured that alternative dimensions were involved simply by the fact that there were second playthrough elements and the title of the game, which kind of gives it away. But I felt this game's story to be quite unique for a multi-dimension plot and the whole alternate universes theme that seems to be explored in a lot of games lately. But this game did it in quite an interesting and unique way. The backstory about the fate materia and the world, and the way of saving the world from destruction by essentially copy-pasting it was really unique. The end's motivations as well were actually quite fleshed out. In a game with only one real antagonist, you do have quite a burden, because if that antagonist doesn't come off as interesting enough, then, well, the whole game's gonna suffer. But the end actually did come off as quite compelling, and he had a good balance of having understandable motives, but still being very clearly the antagonist of the story, and still committing some pretty big atrocities, all in pursuit of revenge. Again, though, you do understand why he wants revenge so much. Now, I have read a lot of things on places like TV Tropes mostly, that some people think that the end got off a bit too easy for the fact that he killed 2 billion people just to get revenge on one guy, but everyone seems to forgive him in the end, and apparently he's all fine and hanging out with everyone else in the ending. What? Okay, here's the thing. After I read that, I was like, did you actually even see the ending? Shaw does express pity for the end, and does understand his motivations, and tells him that he has the right to live, something that he never heard before. But the ending doesn't show that the end is all fine and hanging out with everyone else and they're all friends. No, nothing like that. The end is just seen overlooking the city, saying that they get to live after all, but his actual fate is left ambiguous. So personally, I really don't feel like he got off easy for what he did. Because again, it's left mostly up to your imagination. It's also left mostly up to your imagination whether or not the whole dimensional shenanigans mean that the events that caused him to even become the end never happened in the first place, and thus he never even killed 2 million people to begin with. To sum up, it's definitely not a situation of this villain's committed some horrible atrocities, but yay, we're all happy friends now and we can forget all about that completely. It's not one of those situations at all. As for the other characters, I really liked pretty much all the characters in this game. Really, the only character who I maybe didn't like so much was Sojiro, but that's completely intentional. One thing that I found was interesting is, this game's cast of characters were basically built up to all have basically follow one stereotype, and then deconstructing that stereotype as you got to see their bond conversations and character developments. I can't fully go into this here because that would take probably the space of a whole video in itself, But you got things like George Jackman being the hammy, justice-obsessed hero, who eventually realizes that maybe his sense of justice might not be the same as everyone else's. Sojiro, the doctor who's obsessed with medicine and the power of medicine to heal people, who turns out that he's so obsessed with the power of medicine to heal people that he's willing to commit murder just to preserve the integrity of medicine. Character development doesn't always have to be positive, and I found Sojiro to actually be quite interesting, in that to me, he felt like more of an anti-hero slash borderline villain protagonist done right, in that it's still made clear that the main character does not approve of his actions at all. This is kind of why I dislike how they treated Henry in Fire Emblem Awakening, because all the characters treated as if there was nothing wrong with the fact that he loved blood and murder, which, yeah. Speaking of which, I personally felt that Agito is how I really wish they would have handled Henry in the English localization of Fire Emblem Awakening. Someone who acts creepily cheerful and friendly even in very, very, well, inappropriate situations. But, yeah, who isn't obsessed with blood and stuff. Agito's probably one of my favourite characters, and I love how they deconstruct his whole I'm friends with everyone personality by having him really struggle over the fact that he still wants to be friends with the End, but everyone will suspect him if he thinks that way. And also the fact that him being friends with everyone means he can't really have a best friend. I really liked his conversations, actually. Zenji was interesting in how they explored the consequences of him being able to basically have anything you can do, I can do better powers, and how he basically has almost no identity for himself as a consequence. And Mana as well. Mana was pretty hilarious. She was half affectionate parody of cuteness in general, and also interesting, well, exploration of the fact that she had some pretty serious self-worth issues over the fact that she didn't consider her own powers cute. Himeno as well. Himeno is a really, really interesting character, because I heavily disliked her at first, and towards the end of her Bond conversations, I felt like she was one of my favourite characters in the game, so I'm very annoyed that she never made it to the end in any of my runs. Really, the only character that I'm a little iffy on is Nagi, because her character development of cold, emotionless soldier to, hey, emotions are actually important, is very, very cliche, and I've seen that in, well, pretty much everything these days. But in general, the Bond conversations and the development of the friendships between these characters in the show, I actually felt were quite well written and actually very believable. Some of the Max Bond conversations I actually really felt like I could see genuine friendship between the characters. And that's actually something that's quite hard to do. Even in a lot of Fire Emblem support conversations, I don't see that. Of course, the fact that they managed to develop these characters so well makes the whole traitor system hit you even harder. I'm really glad that I chose to go through this blind, because having to get to know these characters and then having to find out they're traitors and having to get rid of them, that really hits you right in the feels, especially later on when you get to the 4th floor and you start seeing the Max Bond erasure conversations, and yeah, those are some of the most emotional things I've seen out of any game I've played lately. And the fact that which characters you have these emotional moments with changes every time really adds a lot of replay value to this game. One thing I thought was really, really cool was that my 3rd playthrough, I got 3 repeat traitors, and yet all of them gave totally different speeches when they were erased. So I still saw completely new content, even though I got similar traitors. And well, I guess that's all I have to say about this game. Personally, I feel that this is a very good and most likely destined to be very underrated game. That's part of the reason that I even played it, because I got the feeling that it wouldn't really be a big hit. I mean, a new IP in a completely niche genre, yeah, that's a recipe for not doing too well. I definitely encourage people to give this game a go. Whatever console you have, I honestly think that the mission-based structure and the whole replayability that missions and the game itself has actually does lend itself to portable play quite well, so I would actually recommend the Vita version if you have that console. So, that's been my thoughts on this game. Guess there's nothing else left to say here, but see you on the next project.